Page 179. The Old Gorbeau House. 1. 40 years ago, the solitary pedestrian who ventured into the unknown regions of La Salpêtrière went up along the boulevard as far as the Barrière de l'Italie, reached certain points where it might be said that Paris disappeared. It was no longer a solitude, for there were people passing. It was not the country, for there were houses and streets. It was not a city, the streets had ruts in them, like the highways, and grass grew along their borders. It was not a village, the houses were too lofty. What was it then? It was an inhabited place, where there was nobody. It was a desert place, where there was somebody. It was a boulevard of a great city, a street of Paris, wilder at night than a forest, and gloomier by day than a graveyard. It was the old quarter of the horse market. Our pedestrian, if he trusted himself, beyond the four trembling walls of the horse market, if willing to go even further than the Rue des Petits Banquiers, without on his right a courtyard shut in by the lofty walls, then a meadow studded with the stacks of tan bark that looked like the gigantic beaver dams, then an enclosure half filled with lumber and piles of logs, sawdust and shavings from top of which a huge dog was baying, and a long, low ruined wall with a small dark-colored and decrepit gate in it, covered with moss which was full of flowers in springtime. Then in the loneliest spot, a frightful broken-down structure on which could be read in large letters, "Post no bills." This bold promenader, we say, would have reached the corner of the Rue de Vigny Saint-Marcel, a latitude not much explored. There, near a manufactory, and between two garden walls, could be seen at the time of which we speak an old ruined dwelling that at first sight seemed as small as a cottage, yet was in reality as vast as a cathedral. It stood with its gable end toward the highway, and hence its apparent diminutiveness. Nearly the whole house was hidden. Only the door and one window could be seen. This old dwelling had but one story. The door was merely a collection of worm-eaten boards, rudely tacked together with crosspieces that looked like pieces of firewood, clumsily split out. It opened directly on a steep staircase with high steps covered with mud, plaster, and dust, and of the same breadth as the door, and which seemed from the streets to rise perpendicularly like a ladder, and disappear in the shadows between two walls. The window was broad and of considerable height, with large panes in the sashes and provided with Venetian shutters. Only the panes had received a variety of wounds which were at once concealed and made manifest by ingenious strips and bandages of paper, and the shutters were so broken and disjointed that they menaced the passers-by with more than they shielded the occupants of the dwelling. This door with its dirty look, and this window with its decent though dilapidated appearance, seen thus in one and the same building, produced the effect of two ragged beggars bound in the same direction and walking side by side, with different mien under the same rag, one having always been a pauper while the other had been a gentleman. The staircase led up to a very spacious interior, which looked like a barn converted into a house. This structure had for its main channel of communication a long hall, on which there spread upon either side the apartments of different dimensions, scarcely habitable, rather resembling booths than rooms. These chambers looked out upon the shapeless grounds of the neighborhood. Altogether it was dark and dull and dreary, even melancholy, and a sepulchral, which was penetrated either by dim, cold rays of the sun or by icy draughts, according to the situation of cracks in the roof or in the door. One interesting and picturesque peculiarity of this kind of tenement is the monstrous size of the spiders. The letter carriers called the house number 50 to 52, but it was known in the quarter as the Gorbeau house. Page 81. 2. Before this Gorbeau tenement, Jean Valjean stopped like the birds of prey he had chosen this lonely place to make his nest. He fumbled in his waistcoat and took it a sort of night key, opened the door, entered, then carefully closed it again, and ascended the stairway, still carrying Cosette. At the top of the stairway he drew from his pocket another key with which he opened another door. The chamber which he entered closed again immediately, was sort of a garret, rather spacious, furnished only with a mattress spread on the floor, a table and a few chairs. A stove containing a fire, the coals of which were visible, stood in one corner. The street lamp of the boulevard shed a dim light through the poor interior. At the further extremity there was a little room containing a cot bed. On this Jean Valjean laid the child without waking her. He struck a light with a flint and steel and lit a candle with which with his tinderbox stood ready beforehand on the table, and as he had done on the preceding evening, he began to gaze upon Cosette with a look of ecstasy, in which the expression of goodness and tenderness went almost to the verge of insanity. The little girl, with that tranquil confidence which belongs only to extreme strength or extreme weakness, had fallen asleep without knowing with whom she was, and continued to slumber without knowing where she was. Jean Valjean bent down and kissed the child's hand. 9 months before he had kissed the hand of the mother, who also had just fallen asleep. The same mournful, pious, agonizing feeling now filled his heart. He knelt down by the bedside of Cosette. It was broad daylight, and yet the child slept on. A pale ray from the December sun struggled through the garret window, and traced upon the ceiling long streaks of light and shade. Suddenly a carrier's wagon, heavily laden, trundled up over the cobblestones of the boulevard, and shook the old building like the rumbling of a tempest, jarring it from cellar to roof-tree. "Yes, madam," cried Cosette, starting up out of sleep. Here I am, and she threw herself from the bed, her eyelids still half closed with the weight of slumber, stretching out her hand toward the corner of the wall. "Oh, what shall I do? Where is my broom?" said she. By this time her eyes were fully open, and she saw the smiling face of Jean Valjean. "Oh, yes, it is. Yes, so it is," cried the child. "Good morning, monsieur." Children at once accept joy and happiness with quick familiarity, being themselves naturally all happiness and joy. Cosette noticed Catherine at the foot of the bed, laid hold of her at once, and playing the while asked Jean Valjean 1,000 questions. Where was she? Was Paris a big place? Was Madame Thénardier really far away? Wouldn't she come back again? Etc., etc. All at once she exclaimed, "How pretty it is here!" It was a frightful hovel, but she felt free. "Must I sleep?" she continued at length. "Play," replied Jean Valjean. And thus the day passed by. Cosette, without troubling herself with trying to understand anything about it, was inexpressibly happy with her doll and her good friend. Page 187. 4. There was in the neighborhood of Saint Médard a mendicant who sat crouching over the edge of the condemned public well nearby, and to whom Jean Valjean often gave alms. He never passed this man without giving him a few pennies. Sometimes he spoke to him. Those who were envious of this poor creature said that he was in the pay of the police. He was an old church beadle of 75, who was always mumbling prayers. One evening, as Jean Valjean was passing that way, unaccompanied by Cosette, he noticed the beggar sitting in his usual place under the street lamp, which had just been lighted. The man, according to custom, seemed to be praying, and was bent over. Jean Valjean walked up to him and put a piece of money in his hand. As usual, the beggar suddenly raised his eyes, gazed intently at Jean Valjean, and then quickly dropped his head. This moment was like a flash. Jean Valjean shuddered. It seemed to him that he had just seen, by the light of the street lamp, not the calm, sanctimonious face of the aged beadle, but a terrible and well-known countenance. He experienced the sensation one would feel on finding himself suddenly face to face in the gloom with a tiger. He recoiled, horror-stricken and petrified, daring neither to breathe nor to speak, to stay nor to fly, but gazing upon the beggar who had once more bent down his head, with its tattered covering, and seemed to no longer conscious of his presence. At this singular moment, an instinct, perhaps the mysterious instinct of self-preservation, prevented Jean Valjean from uttering a word. The beggar had the same form, in the same rags, and the same general appearance as on every other day. "Pshaw," said Jean Valjean to himself. "I am mad, I am dreaming, it cannot be," and he went home anxious and ill at ease. He scarcely dared to admit even to himself that the countenance he thought he had seen was the face of Javert. That night, upon reflection, he regretted that he had not questioned the man, as to compel him to raise his head a second time. On the morrow at nightfall, he went thither again. The beggar was in his place. Good day," said Jean Valjean, with firmness, as he gave him the accustomed alms. The beggar raised his head and answered in a whining voice, "Thanks, kind sir, thanks." It was indeed only the old beadle. Jean Valjean now felt fully reassured. He even began to laugh. "What in the deuce, I was about to fancy that I saw Javert," thought he. "Is my sight growing poor already?" And he thought no more about it. Some days after, it might be 8 o'clock in the evening, he was in his room giving Cosette her spelling lesson. which the child was repeating in a loud voice, when he heard the door of the building open and close again. That seemed odd to him. The old woman, the only occupant of the house besides himself and Cosette, always went to bed at dark, to save candles. Jean Valjean made a sign to Cosette to be silent. He heard someone coming up the stairs. Possibly it might be the old woman who had felt unwell and had been to the druggist's. Jean Valjean listened. The footsteps was heavy, and sounded like a man's, but the old woman wore heavy shoes, and there is nothing so much as like the step of a man as the step of an old woman. However, Jean Valjean blew out his candle. He sent Cosette to bed, telling her in a suppressed voice to lie down very quietly, and as he kissed her on the forehead, the footsteps stopped. Jean Valjean remained silent and motionless, his back turned toward the door, still seated on his chair from which he had not moved, and holding his breath in the darkness. After a considerable interval, not hearing anything more, he turned round, without making any noise, and as he raised his eyes toward the door of his room, he saw a light through the keyhole. This ray of light was an evil star in the black background of the door in the wall. There was evidently somebody outside with a candle who was listening. A few minutes elapsed, and the light disappeared, but he heard no sound of footsteps, which seemed to indicate that whoever was listening at the door had taken off his shoes. Jean Valjean threw himself on his bed without undressing, but could not shut his eyes that night. At daybreak he was sinking into slumber from fatigue. He was aroused again by the creaking of the door of someone at the end of the hall, and then he heard the same footstep which had ascended the stairs on the preceding night. The step approached. He started from his bed and placed his eye to the keyhole, which was quite a large one, hoping to get a glimpse of the person, whoever it might be, who had made his way into the building in the night time and had listened at his door. It was a man indeed, who passed by Jean Valjean's room this time without stopping. The hall was still too dark for him to make out his features, but when the man reached for the stairs, a ray of light from without made his figure stand out like a profile, and Jean Valjean had a full view of his back. The man was tall, wore a long frock coat, and had a cudgel under his arm. It was the redoubtable form of Javert. Jean Valjean might have tried to get another look at him through his window that opened on the boulevard, but he would have had to raise the sash, and he dared not do. It was evident that the man had entered by means of a key, as if at home. Who then had given him the key, and what was the meaning of this? At 7 a.m, he made a roll of 100 francs he had in a drawer and put it into his pocket. Do what he would to manage this so that the clinking of the silver could not be heard, a 5-franc piece escaped his grasp, and rolled, jingling away on the floor. At dusk he went to the street door and looked carefully up and down the boulevard. No one was to be seen. The boulevard seemed to be utterly deserted. It is true that there might have been someone hidden behind a tree. He went upstairs again. "Come," said he to Cosette. He took her by the hand, and they both went out. Page 190. A dark chase leads a silent hound. 1. Jean Valjean had immediately left the boulevard and began to thread the streets, making as many turns as he could, returning sometimes upon his track to make sure that he was not followed. The moon was full. Jean Valjean was not sorry for that. The moon, still near the horizon, cut large prisms of light and shade in the streets. Jean Valjean could glide along the houses and the walls in the dark, and observe the light side. He did not perhaps sufficiently realize that the obscure side escaped him. However, in all the deserted little streets in the neighborhood of the Rue des Poliveaux, he felt sure that no one was behind him. Jean Valjean described many and varied labyrinths in the corridor of Montfaucon, which was asleep already, as were still under the discipline of the Middle Age and the yoke of the curfew, which he produced different combinations in wise, strategy with the Queue Censeur and the Rue Coppel, the Rue des Bateaux Saint-Victor, and the Rue des Petits Ermites. As 11 o'clock struck the tower of the Saint-Étienne du Mont, he crossed the Rue des Pontis in the front of the bureau of the commissary of police, which is at number 14. Some moments afterward, the instinct of which we have already spoken made him turn his head. At this moment he saw distinctly, thanks to the commissary's lamp, which revealed them, 3 men following him quite near, passed one after the other under this lamp on the dark side of the street. One of these men entered the passage leading to the commissary's house. The one in advance appeared to him decidedly suspicious. "Come, child," said he to Cosette, and made haste to get out of the Rue des Pontis. He made a circuit, went round the Arcade des Patriarches, which was closed on account of the lateness of the hour, walked rapidly through the Rue des Épées des Boues and the Rue des Arbalètes, and plunged into the Rue des Postes. There was a large square there where the Collège des Roulines now is, and from which the branches of the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève. The moon lighted up this square brightly. Jean Valjean concealed himself in the doorway, calculating that if these men were still following him, he could not fail to get a good view of them when they crossed this lighted space. In fact, 3 minutes had not elapsed when the 3 men appeared. There were now 4 of them. All were tall, dressed in long brown coats, with round hats and great clubs in their hands. They were not less fearfully forbidding by their size and their large fists than by their stealthy tread in the darkness. One would have taken them for 4 spectres in citizen's dress. They stopped in the center of the square and formed a group, like people consulting. They appeared undecided. The man who seemed to be the leader turned and energetically pointed in the direction in which Jean Valjean was. One of the others seemed to insist with some obstinacy on the contrary direction. At the instant when the leader turned, the moon shone full in his face. Jean Valjean recognized Javert perfectly. Page 192. 2. Uncertainty was at an end for Jean Valjean. Happily, it still continued with these men. He took advantage of their hesitation. It was a time lost for them, gained for him. He came out of the doorway in which he was concealed, and made his way into the Rue des Postes, toward the region of the Jardin des Plantes. Cosette began to be tired. He took her in his arms and carried her. There was nobody in the streets, and the lamps had not been lighted on account of the moon. He doubled his pace. He passed through the Rue de la Clève, taken by the Fontaine de Saint-Victor, along the Jardin des Plantes, by the lower streets, and reached the quay. There he looked around. The quay was deserted. The streets were deserted. Nobody behind him. He took a breath. He arrived at the bridge of Austerlitz. A large cart was passing by the scene, and at the same time, like him, was going toward the right bank. This could be made of use. He could go the whole length of the bridge in the shade of the cart. From the point where he was, he could see the whole length of the bridge of the Austerlitz. 4 shadows at that moment entered upon the bridge. These shadows were coming from the Jardin des Plantes toward the right bank. These 4 shadows were the 4 men. Jean Valjean felt a shudder like that of the deer when he sees the hounds again upon his track. One hope was left him. By plunging into the little street before him, if he could succeed in reaching the wood yards and the marshes, the fields, the open grounds, he could escape. It seemed to him that he might trust himself to this silent little street. He entered it. Page 193. 3. Some 300 paces on, he reached a point where the street forked. It divided into 2 streets, the one turning off obliquely to the left and the other to the right. Jean Valjean had before him 2 branches of a Y. Which should he choose? He did not hesitate, but took the right. Why? Because the left branch led toward the Faubourg, that is to say, toward the inhabited region, and the right branch toward the country, that is, toward the uninhabited region. He turned from time to time and looked back. He took care to always be on the dark side of the street. The street was straight behind him. The 2 or 3 first times he turned, he saw nothing. The silence was complete, and he kept on his way, somewhat reassured. Suddenly, on turning again, he thought he saw in the portion of the street through which he had just passed, far in the obscurity, something which stirred. He plunged forward rather than walked, hoping to find some side street by which to escape, and once more to elude his pursuers. He came to a wall. This wall, however, did not prevent him from going further. It was a wall forming the side of a cross alley, in which the street Jean Valjean was then in came to an end. Here again he must decide. Should he take the right or the left? He looked to the right. The alley ran out to a space between some buildings that were mere sheds or barns, then terminated abruptly. At the end of this blind alley was plain to be seen a great white wall. He looked to the left. The alley on this side was open, and about 200 paces further on ran into the street, of which was affluent. In this direction lay safety. The instant Jean Valjean decided to turn to the left to try to reach the street, which he saw at the end of the alley, he perceived in the corner of the alley, and the street toward which he was just about going, a sort of black, motionless statue. It was a man who had just been posted there, evidently, and was waiting for him, guarding the passage. Jean Valjean was startled. Such was the quarter of the last century. The Petite Pécasse had what we had just called a Y of streets, formed by the Rue des Chemins vers Saint-Antoine, dividing into two branches, and taking on the left the same Petite Rue Picpus, and on the right the name of the Rue Polonceau. The two branches of the Y were joined at the top as by a bar. This bar was called the Rue Droit-Mur. The Rue Polonceau ended there, and the Petite Rue Picpus passed beyond, rising toward the Marché Lenoir. He who was coming from the Seine reached the extremity of the Rue Le Ponceau, had on his left the Rue Droit-Mur, turning sharply at the right angle before him on the side wall of that street, and on his right a truncated prolongation of the Rue Droit-Mur without thoroughfare called the Cul-de-sac General. Jean Valjean was in this place, as we have said, on perceiving the black form standing sentry in the corner of the Rue Droit-Mur and the Petite Rue Picpus. He was startled. There was no doubt he was watched by the shadow. What should he do? There was no time to turn back. What he had seen moving in the obscurity some distance behind him the moment before was undoubtedly Javert and his squad. Javert probably had reached the commencement of the street of which Jean Valjean was at the end. Javert, to all appearances, was acquainted with this little trap, and had taken his precautions by sending one of his men to guard the exit. These conjectures, like certainties, whirled about wildly in Jean Valjean's troubled brain, as a handful of dead dust flies before a sudden blast. He scrutinized the Cul-de-sac General. There were high walls. He scrutinized the Petit Rue Picpus. There was a sentinel. He saw the dark form repeated in black upon the white pavement flooded with the moonlight. To advance was to fall upon that man. To go back was to throw himself into Javert's hands. Jean Valjean felt as if caught by a chain that was slowly winding up. He looked up into the sky in despair. Page 195. 4. At this moment a muffled and regular sound began to make itself heard at some distance. Jean Valjean ventured to thrust his head a little way around the corner of the street. 7 or 8 soldiers, formed in platoon, had just turned into the Rue Polonceau. He saw the gleam of their bayonets. They were coming toward him. The soldiers at whose head he distinguished the tall form of Javert advanced slowly and with precaution. They stopped frequently. It was plain that they were exploring all the recesses of the walls and all the entrances of doors and alleys. It was, and here conjecture could not be deceived, some patrol which Javert had met and which he had put in requisition. Javert's 2 assistants marched in the ranks. At the rate at which they were marching the stops they were making, it would take them about a quarter of an hour to arrive at the spot where Jean Valjean was. It was a frightful moment. A few minutes separated Jean Valjean from the awful precipice which was opening before him for the 3rd time. And the galleys now were no longer simply the galleys. They were Cosette lost forever, that is to say, a life in death. There was now only one thing possible. Jean Valjean had this peculiarity that he might be said to carry 2 knapsacks. In one he had the thoughts of a saint, in the other the formidable talents of a convict. He helped himself one or the other as occasion required. Among the other resources, thanks to his numerous escapes from the galleys at Toulon, he had, it will be remembered, some master of that incredible art of raising himself in the right angle of a wall, if need be to the height of a 6th story. An art without ladders or props, by mere muscular strength, supporting himself by the back of his neck, his shoulders, his hips, and his knees, hardly making use of the few projections on the stone which rendered so terrible and so celebrated the corner of the yard of the Conciergerie of Paris, by which some 20 years ago the convict Batamolet made his escape. Jean Valjean was measured with his eyes the wall above which he saw a lime tree. It was about 18 feet high. The wall was capped by a flat stone without any projection. The difficulty was Cosette. Cosette did not know how to scale a wall. Abandon her? Jean Valjean did not think of it. To carry her was impossible. The whole strength of a man is necessary to accomplish these strange ascents. The least burden would make him lose his center of gravity, and he would fall. He needed a cord. Jean Valjean had none. Where could he find a cord at midnight in the Rue Le Ponceau? Truly, at that instant, if Jean Valjean had a kingdom, he would have given it for a rope. All extreme situations have their flashes, which sometimes make us blind, sometimes illuminate us. The despairing gaze of Jean Valjean encountered the lamp-post in the cul-de-sac Jarreau. At this epoch there was no gas lights in the streets of Paris. At nightfall they lighted the street lamps, which were placed at intervals, and were raised and lowered by means of a rope traversing the street from end to end, running through the grooves of the posts. The reel on which this rope was wound was enclosed below the lantern in a little iron box, the key of which was kept by the lamplighter, and the rope itself was projected by a casing of metal. Jean Valjean, with the energy of a final struggle, crossed to the street at a bound, entered the cul-de-sac, sprang the bolted little box with the point of his knife, and in an instant was back at the side of Cosette. He had a rope. These desperate inventors of expedients in their mighty struggles with fatality moved electrically in case of need. We have explained that the street lamps had not been lighted at that night. The lamp in the cul-de-sac Genrot was then, as a matter of course, extinguished like the rest, and one might pass by without even noticing that it was not in its place. Meanwhile, the hour, the place, the darkness, the preoccupation of Jean Valjean, his singular actions, his going to and fro, all this began to disturb Cosette. Any other child would have uttered loud cries long before. She contented herself with pulling Jean Valjean by the skirt of his coat. The sound of the approaching patrol was constantly becoming more and more distinct. "Father," said she, in a whisper, "I am afraid. Who is it that is coming?" "Hush," answered the unhappy man. "It is the Thénardier." Cosette shuddered. He added, "Don't say a word. I'll take care of her. If you cry, if you make any noise, the Thénardier will hear you. She is coming to catch you." Then, without any haste, but without doing anything a second time, with a firm and rapid decision so much the more remarkable at such a moment, when the patrol and Javert might come upon him at any instant, he took off his cravat, passing it around Cosette's body under the arms, taking care that it would not hurt the child, attached his cravat to the end of the rope by means of the knot which seamen call the swallow knot, took the other end of this rope, and in his teeth took off his shoes and stockings and threw them over the wall, and began to raise himself in the angle of the wall and the gable with as much solidity and certainty as if he had the rounds of a ladder under his heels and his elbows. Half a minute had not passed before he was on his knees on the wall. Cosette watched him, stupefied, without saying a word. Jean Valjean's charge in the name of the Thénardier had made her dumb. All at once she heard Jean Valjean's voice calling to her in a low whisper, "Put your back against the wall." She obeyed. "Don't speak, and don't be afraid," added Jean Valjean, and she felt herself lifted from the ground. Before she had time to think where she was at the top of the wall. Jean Valjean seized her and put her on his back. He took her two little hands in his left hand, lay down flat, and crawled along the top of the wall. As he had supposed, there was a building there, the roof of which sloped very nearly to the ground, with a gentle inclination. A fortunate circumstance, for the wall was much higher on this side than on the street. Jean Valjean saw the ground beneath him at a great depth. He had just reached the inclined plane of the roof, and had not yet left the crest of the wall, when a violent uproar proclaimed the arrival of the patrol. He heard the thundering voice of Javert. "Search the cul-de-sac. The Rue de Droit-Mur is guarded. The Petit Rue Picpus also. I'll answer for it if he is in the cul-de-sac." The soldiers rushed into the cul-de-sac Genrot. Jean Valjean slid down the roof, keeping a hold of Cosette, reached the lime tree, and jumped to the ground. Whether from terror or from courage, Cosette had not uttered a whisper. Her hands were a little scraped.